So why does communicating climate risk matter? Um, you'll find yourself communicating climate risks in many ways with people who either understand that from a technical perspective, or those who may have no idea what climate risk is, or really be unfamiliar with climate change. And so when we think about the why, or the impetus or rationale for communication in this space, it's important that we can address misconceptions. It's important that we begin to be able to make a compelling case for understanding risk and therefore investments that are more future-proofed. It's important to actually make the case for climate adaptation solutions that are coming down the line out of a risk assessment process. And it's important to avoid inaction and to build capacity in risk management. A good example is that there are many traditional risk management or risk assessment expertise across the world. A much smaller of those understand climate change risk management. And so there's capacity building in the risk field, but also across other professions in general. So just to begin, making a compelling case for understanding climate risk. We cannot rely on historical information only to make these decisions, especially as we know that the climate is changing and will bring unforeseen or extreme conditions. So we want to make that case to use historical information together with climate models to support scenario-based planning. So I like to focus on communication in terms of questions and answers, or to have more informal chats. So asking questions like, what happens if we don't know our climate risks? What consequences could occur? Are we liable if something happens? Can we find opportunities by looking across climate risks? These are common questions we get asked in Canada. They're common questions, I'm assuming, across the world. And so having conversations that can be challenging is a very valuable way to make these compelling cases clearer. So just to reflect on that a little bit further, which of the following images would be more helpful to you to contextualize extreme rainfall? Would you prefer a graph like this that actually shows data sets and different projections of rainfall? In this case, this showing millimeters per day, showing catastrophic projection data sets from 2016 or 2020. The second reason why we should be communicating climate risks are to address misconceptions. So we know, climate change and strong experience along the land, the climate has always changed. We are seeing widespread rapid changes in the atmosphere, build your own case in terms of how you might respond to those misconceptions. So for example, yes, there have been significant historical ice ages. However, we are experiencing a variable change stream in carbon dioxide. Another strong reason why we need to communicate this information is to make the case for adaptation investments. So good communication and scoping of risk assessments can enable investment, especially the understanding that it's not just another cost, but it's actually an investment that will benefit everyone over the long term and save us money down the road. Realistically, this can be a challenging conversation to have, but it's very helpful to kind of frame it as costs invested now in resilience and in disaster mitigation technologies and solutions can save us. We're seeing numbers of $1 to $6 to $7 down the road. And so that return on investment can be a powerful tool. And again, I always come back to, in these conversations, in a risk assessment, begin with the end in mind. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? How can these communication of this information help us get there? And lastly, the reason why this is so important is that we need to avoid inaction and build capacity. So among traditional risk managers, among people who don't work with risk, talking about what risk tolerance is, so these communications and these conversations helps us to find how comfortable people are with risk or their risk tolerance. So at what point are we going to accept some level of risk? And at what point will we not accept risk? We cannot avoid risk entirely. It's something we have to live with. But at what point are we comfortable with that? And at what point are we managing that residual risk? Once we know that, we can identify strategic actions and avoid doing everything everywhere, which is a big concern of people who want to invest in this type of work or who may be hesitant to invest. We can then kind of tell them that we are curating or tailoring our priorities associated with what we know to be priority risks. So what is climate change communication? Let's talk about it's the process of transmitting or sharing in very big space on the causes and impacts of climate change. People have how very minimal attention to those impacts, given how much the information is out there today, in order, and they're being told in many different directions. Raise awareness. So if we think about risk communication now, it's more specific and it's more specialized. So it's a specialized form of communication, and it's used to enhance the comprehension for knowledge and decision making out of risk assessments or associated with risk assessments. It can be persuasive, it can be based on science and defensible. It depends on the rationale and guided by the best interests of those who want to communicate it. It is not spin, it is not public relations, it is grounded in science and robust information. And it's also important to note that risk communication and climate communications in general are a balancing act. So, for example, risks can be very complex, they can be very detailed. Communicating those risks doesn't have to be so complicated. So we can avoid going down the rabbit hole, avoid oversharing or overemphasizing uncertainty, for example, to the point where it gets confusing or it can actually create inaction. A good example is this graph, which I love communicating to a technical audience around why we have to be preparing for multiple futures in the context of climate change assessments, and how do we pick multiple scenarios to assess. However, to a non-technical audience, this can be quite paralyzing. They may look at this pyramid and say, why are we bothering investing in this at all? We don't know where we're going. And so I think it's important to always have that balancing act in the back of your mind. And of course, try to push the envelope, be proactive, and really, garner that interest and investment in this space, which is so important. So now that we've covered the why and the what we're communicating, let's talk about who and when this information needs to be targeted to, and how do we really build this into our projects and our day-to-day work. So one thing that might be helpful in any context or in any risk assessment or climate project is identifying your audiences and their needs. So again, beginning with the end in mind, who are we trying to target with this? Are they technical? Are they non-technical? How many different groups are there? What are their interests? Are there concerns? Try to meet them halfway to the extent that you can. What is the desired effect of the information? Are you hoping that the general public might need this information to build their own personal or family capacity? Is this solely kind of restricted for professionals or confidential, perhaps, and you're hoping that they could use it to inform facility level decision making? What do they need to know, or what do they already know? So these are just helpful questions to have, perhaps as part of a workshop session, or perhaps to inform kind of chats among one-on-ones with different people involved. And finally, what are the appropriate channels to move this information through to the audiences? Are we talking online only? Are we talking about training sessions? Are we talking about telephone? Different mediums can be really helpful to think about as well. So how can we, or should we, plan for effective communication? Just a couple of thoughts on this before we wrap up. Try to think about message content and delivery method. So understand that people have external factors and values that are driving them outside of course, of the technical information. It's very easy to kind of think about it from your own perspective and try to push it out that way, but always try to understand what may be motivating people in this space. It could be fear, for example. They may not want to hear this valuable information around risk or around climate change because they're concerned that they're not doing enough, or they're denying because they're afraid of what it might mean for their families. So always try to understand contextual factors and their values, and present the most relevant, curated, or tailored information for better comprehension. And by combining these two things, we can really try to optimize and create the best risk communications. So general practical approach in this space is to always identify your target audience as part of any project. Begin with that in mind. I'll keep saying it. Define risk communication goals. What are your goals for communication? Is that an important aspect of your work? Prepare the messaging content and the actual drafts and review those or discuss that. Implement that and deliver it through the channels that are most appropriate, whether that be workshops, online sessions, websites, etc. And then ultimately, implementation and evaluation. So don't be afraid to monitor, adjust, iterate. There's many examples of this. We are seeing, for instance, flood hazard maps be increasingly shared in Canada. There's a lot of concern around lawsuits and liability with that. However, people who are releasing them, the government agencies, for example, are learning. They're monitoring, they're learning, they're evaluating that, and they're constantly iterating how they frame what those are and what they are not, and how people can understand their data to meet their needs. Tone and language are also helpful to think about. Try to use everyday language to the extent to which you can. Avoid technical jargon. Try to avoid talking down to people or that perception of you talking down to them. And please don't use acronyms or technical terms. Try to expand on everything, take more time for things, and use an active voice. So we did this, we are doing this, or this was done. And so just some final guidance before we wrap up this session. Communication is very important even in the most technical projects. And so it can facilitate that transfer of information to informed action. And so don't necessarily scope this out, even if it's an internal technical exercise. Make a plan and just set realistic goals for yourself. And know your audience and don't dismiss their values. And I'm going to say it one more time, try to begin with that ideal endpoint in mind.